Our next panel addresses the topic of building resilience in times of crisis, how Australia can adapt and thrive in the face of challenges, and we hope that the conversation will build on what we've already heard today. To introduce the panel, I'm going to first introduce the moderator. Louise Adams is an engineer, business manager and a prominent leader in infrastructure with substantial international experience. She's led a plethora of civil and multidisciplinary projects in land development and technical advisory for project planning, and currently she drives Aurecon's financial, operational and people performance. Louise was named Australian CEO of the Year for her role as Chief Executive of Aurecon Australia and New Zealand. She became an ATSE Fellow in 2021. Please welcome her to the stage.
A fairly broad-ranging topic, and if you think about it in the context of the discussion that we just had on the journey to decarbonisation and the energy transition, and then broaden that out in the context of how we achieve those sorts of goals with the complexities of geopolitical risks, economic risks, things like cybersecurity and AI, but also locally with the communities quite rightly demanding a bit more social licence to operate. So it's a pleasure for me to bring our panel up. I'll just get you to come straight up onto the stage. Firstly, we have Dr. Therese Flapper. Jane MacMaster. Adjunct Professor Daniel Lambert. Dr. Susannah Eliott and Professor Brian Schmidt. So we're going to get into this topic straight away. As I said, I think it is quite an interesting topic and such a broad-ranging piece, and I have been given strict instructions that we can't spend all day talking about it, unfortunately. So to kick off our discussions, we're just going to let our panellists introduce themselves, but I would like to congratulate you all on your induction into ATSE. You all have individual and unique expertise that you can bring to this topic, so I think we said we'd try and get it done in 30 seconds each. We'll see how we go, but if you could just please briefly introduce yourselves. We'll start with you, Therese.
Yes, good morning. My name is Therese Flapper, and thank you for being able to use that language. I have a lifelong career, mostly dominant in the water sector. So when recycled water also wasn't sexy and now we want to drink it, as well as that conversion into industry and city application. I have been involved in lots of industry associations, and I think it's a real responsibility to be involved in the industry with which you want to participate so that you have a really broad lens of what you're looking for. And at the moment, very much looking at putting the A in STEM and making STEAM, because the arts and humanities are key to anything we want to do in science, technology, engineering or maths. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. It is a true honour to be here. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. My background is in mechanical and aerospace engineering. I spent 15 years working in defence industry, helping to design a pretty complicated supersonic flight vehicle system. And that 15 years taught me the importance of design and systems thinking and bringing about outcomes. My career then took a little bit of a shift, and I worked in government for between 6 and 10 years. And I took those principles of design and systems thinking to delivering policy outcomes. So I'm absolutely passionate about engineering and the technological sciences and what they bring in terms of design and systems thinking to bring about outcomes, both technology and broader societal outcomes. In my current role at Engineers Australia, we are supporting engineers throughout their entire career, from student and actually earlier in the pipeline, the schooling years, encouraging those young Australians to consider studying and working in engineering, but then supporting engineers throughout their career to practice competently, ethically, and of course contributing as much value as they can in their work in engineering.
Great, thanks Louise. Daniel Lambert, I've been in the water industry for my entire career and more recently doing a lot of work in the renewable energy space. Really passionate about the role that we play as as engineers and scientists, not just in solving technical problems, but in their ability to actually drive social and environmental change. And recently I've taken on a role as an innovation accelerator with a group called Water Start, and we're looking at intergovernment collaboration between Australia and Nevada and California and the UK around how to bring new technology to life, and really excited about the role that we play in driving solutions and inspiring the next generation.
Yeah, hi, Susannah Eliott. I started out as a cell and developmental biologist studying the very weird and wonderful creature called a slime mold, for anybody who knows slime molds. And then I took a bit of a turn and decided that I was really interested in communication. And so I did a postgraduate diploma in journalism at UTS, and then took over management of the Centre for Science Communication there, where we kind of working with journalists and scientists on all sorts of different topics. I then went to Sweden, where I was working for a UN-affiliated research organisation that was trying to understand how the whole Earth was changing over time. And if anyone remembers Will Steffen, I was working with Will Steffen there, a wonderful scientist. There it was a huge challenge, which I think is relevant to the discussion today, which was really that, from the 1990s, we were trying to explain to the global population about tipping points, about the great acceleration, which has really taken off since the 1950s, with everything from carbon in the atmosphere through to the number of mobile phones, to just everything you look at, the charts are going up like that. At what point do we reach tipping points? And at what point do they become then, leading to irreversible changes? And that's an incredibly difficult concept to get across to people. I then came back to Australia, where I worked with some others to establish the Australian Science Media Centre in Adelaide. And there we were again working between the scientific community, the research community and the media, working on everything from AI to energy to diseases, throw in an odd pandemic, just about everything. Any kind of headline that is underpinned by science. We're working in those areas. The areas that are the most confusing to the public are the areas that we're kind of trying to work on. And we're working with the journalists to try and increase the amount of evidence-based science in the media. I think for this discussion, one of the things that really worries me about communication, and I think really the role of communication is increasing, and it's in people's minds now because they realise how important it is. But one of the big challenges, I think, is the division that's happening within communities because of the amount of misinformation. And so communication is incredibly important. I'll leave it there.
I'm Brian Schmidt, so I'm currently the Vice Chancellor of the Australian National University, but I will be finishing up in that role after 8 years. Running the National University gives you a chance to be across the whole breadth of the academy, from all of the STEM subjects, but also how they interact with the non-STEM subjects. So in that role, you deal with everything from the education of the next generation, the foundational research and the applied research and its translation in creating startup companies. We also have a huge program of public policy, which helps create sensible policy that we continue to work on. I am a physicist, astronomer by training, and in the role of being a cosmologist and kind of being lucky in making a major discovery, I get the opportunity through my Nobel Prize, I think, to go out and have a chat with people around Australia and around the world, and I try to bring in as much information as I can from all sources so I can do that as sensibly as possible.
Well, thanks everyone for those introductions. Jane, I'm going to start with you. So as you said, you've had this dedicated career where you've worked in public, you've worked in private, and now you're in the industry bodies, and you have this passion for STEM that you talked about. So what role do you think people with STEM skills can and should play in helping to build a more resilient Australia?
Yeah, well, as I said, I worked for the first 15 years of my career as an engineer, but it wasn't until I started working in government that I first really appreciated my engineering training, because until that point I'd just been surrounded by engineers and I just thought that everyone thought like engineers did. So it was a bit of a surprise when I ended up in a government department of 500 people and there was only one other engineer in the building on a different floor at the other end. I learned a lot about how government works and how policy is made, but after a couple of years I began to get a growing sense of frustration that the STEM mindset and skill set could play a greater role in how policy is made and how policy designs for all the outcomes that we collectively want could play. So I became quite passionate about engineering and STEM in general. So I think our mindset and skill set plays a really valuable role in design, not just of the technological systems that we all work on, but the design of any system, any social system, and we all know that systems are transdisciplinary now, so they all need to be designed. I think that's a really important skill set. The other really important way I think STEM professionals have a role to play in resilience, which is a big word, is through our quantitative understanding of the world. I know it's a bit simplistic to say that the world can be understood in qualitative ways and quantitative ways, but STEM professionals tend to have that quantitative reasoning and that quantitative background. We have an alarming decline in the number of students studying intermediate and advanced level maths in Australia, if you look at the data released by ATSE. And so the pool of people, we are getting a lot of skilled migrants into the country, which is great, but that quantitative mindset and skill set is really important. And the more reliance we have on data and digitisation, we all know that data can reveal incredible insights and provide the evidence base that we need to inform policy and design, but data can also lead us down the wrong path if it's not collected well, processed well and interpreted well. So we need quantitative literate people in the workforce. So I think that's just a couple of ways that STEM professionals have a really vital role to play.
Yeah, thanks for that. Therese, I'll come to you next. In your own introduction and in the discussions we've had, what struck me is your passion for using the skills, and you have throughout your career used your skills to improve community outcomes, both in Australia and abroad. And Jane touched on design. So what, in your experience, what strategies can be used to ensure that we keep that human-centred approach to solutions in favour of perhaps leaning more towards politics or economics or other factors?
A couple of things that I've come across in the career and experiences has been very much about listening and listening to the end users. And end users for me have often been not just the community, but also the day-to-day people who are going to operate whatever you're building. So everything I've worked on has always been built. So it always ends up in something that people are daily going to need to work with. And it was amazing how often that if you would have a conversation with the people that are going to daily deal with that, what outcomes you would get that were different to just what an engineer might design. I also have a husband for a tradie, so he would also very generously point out the things that the engineers were going to try to do that just would never work. So I think being very multifaceted, listening reports, designing with country, voice, all of these are very topical for us in society at the moment, but they actually all just come down to a core part of humanity, which is kindness. And I think if we start out by looking to design for all and plan for all, you actually then end up being inclusive for everybody, and you get completely different outcomes when you do that. Regulation. It's already been mentioned in the first panel as one of the often barriers. Absolutely true, and continues. And I know I've been recently commenting on LinkedIn about yet another demonstration plant to demonstrate you can drink recycled water. I really don't know why we have to keep demonstrating it. Perhaps that's around communication and how we're able to communicate that in the social sciences that we need to continue to learn from.
Yeah, thanks for that. Daniel, you work in the same sector as Therese and obviously know each other quite well. And building on that, in your experience, when we talk about stakeholders and this idea of engaging them, which stakeholders do you think are the most important in terms of engaging and getting these stories across and understanding?
Yeah, great question. And Therese has already touched on obviously having the community at the heart of what we do. And I think it's interesting, we can learn a little bit from the international development sector and that journey of from a humanitarian perspective in the past, we used to go into communities and do things to communities as opposed to go in, listen to them, learn from them, understand, and then apply those learnings. And I actually think we're on a positive trajectory in Australia in terms of how we do that, but there's still so much opportunity for us to listen to First Nations communities, engage with them effectively. 2 weeks ago, I was up at the Pilbara Infrastructure Summit, and they've been doing it for a number of years and had all the big resources companies, and there's a lot of appetite around renewable energy and etc., and huge economic powerhouse for our nation. But it was the first time that First Nations community has been on the platform speaking as panelists and having a voice. And I'm really excited about how do we get better at listening to those stakeholders, working with them and delivering win-win outcomes, because we've got a huge opportunity, as we heard this morning, around decarbonisation. But how do we take that, work with our First Nations communities to deliver amazing outcomes for them, and actually develop our industry in terms of exporting technology as well as just digging dirt out of the ground and sending it overseas.
Yeah, thank you. Susannah, I find your career journey quite interesting, you know, that convergence of so many of these themes. So we've talked a lot about engaging people, and you sort of touched on it in your intro, and in the age that is defined by platforms like TikTok, and as you said, considerable misinformation, how do we get the community to listen to, much less really understand, the scientific realities of some of these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, if I had a simple answer to that question, probably we wouldn't be in some of the predicaments that we're in. It's difficult, and there isn't a simple answer. I do have my own point of view, and I'm sure there's lots of people that would have their different points of view on this. I think the first thing is we have to stop whinging about social media because the horse has bolted. There are people working behind the scenes with platforms to try and stop misinformation, but it's really, really hard. So my view is that we need to empower those younger scientists, engineers, technologists who actually understand social media and how to use it, and try and drown out the misinformation with good quality information. I think as institutions, we sort of tend to tinker around the edges. We think, great, we'll get onto TikTok or we'll get onto Instagram because that's what you do. But what ends up happening is it tends to be a one-way communication because we're not really, we haven't grown up with it. We don't know how to actually communicate with people as opposed to just trying to shoot information out at them. So my feeling is that if we could empower this upcoming generation of people who've grown up with it and know how to actually use things like Instagram and TikTok to really engage in dialogue and put out good quality information, then, and not see it as a waste of time, then I think we'll be halfway there.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And Brian, your passionate voice for STEM research, innovation and education in Australia, and I've got a two-pronged question for you. Firstly, we know we have skills shortages around STEM, so how do we achieve our full potential if we're short of STEM skills and those qualified to teach it also? And then secondly, do you think we need a culture shift in Australia around valuing these skills more?
So to the first question, I think there's no easy fix. You're not going to turn things on. Clearly, amongst the next generation, we've talked earlier about the declining number of people who are numerate. We actually have a declining number of people who are literate as well. Those are both key skills I've focused on, and say we have to focus in our K through 12 system to ensure students come out numerate and literate. And then I think someone else was saying I didn't talk about civics. Yeah, good. It would be good if they're good citizens as well. And everything else we can worry about afterwards. So I think there has to be a focus on that. Most of us are not people who are experts in pedagogy, but there are people who are, and they should focus on it and work on it. I know here in the ACT, they have turned around our PISA numbers a little bit, and they have focused on it, and that's a good thing. But there are skill shortages that can be adopted, can be fixed in some ways. One thing that I'm seeing my students do is we talk about work integrated learning. My students are really doing work integrated learning, which is in years 3, 4, and 5, they're actually being paid as full-time employees working 3 days a week. And they are really, those employers are getting very good students who maybe they wouldn't normally get. And it's kind of a win-win. And young students are really technically gifted. They're not often wise, but they have incredible talents. And you can get people there who just not going to have access to otherwise. And of course, they become much, much better employees of the future, and your chances of retaining them are good. So I think that's one way. In mid-career, I was just giving a talk yesterday to the Deans of Science and showing female participation rate in Australia. It's a lot better than it was, but if you look at male participation rate since 1900, it's been about 90% for the entire career. Women goes, and there's this huge gap during childbirth era, and we can literally find 25% more people, 25% more engineers, if you keep them engaged during that time, so they have time off that's appropriate, but you keep them in and engaged and then have to reboot their career when they're 40. All right, so huge opportunity there. And then in the short term, one thing I'm finding is we had this great retirement. After a year, a lot of people going, this kind of sucks. And so I can tell you that go back to your people who retired and bring them back, maybe in a part-time capacity, and I think there's a great opportunity there. How do we go through and get Australia to value more? Well, we have to make the careers that people are getting attractive. And, you know, students are not necessarily brilliant at thinking about their future, they're not dumb. And so if you look at the numbers right now, certainly the science side of things doesn't look that attractive of careers. Now, a lot depends on what you're doing in science. And so, for example, I know my physicists do very well like an engineer, but my psychologist, not so great. And so I do think we have to make sure our students have real clarity what the careers look like. But the engineering shortfall, which is a huge one for this country, you know, if you bring women on scale, you'll probably fix most of the problem. But it's really a K through 12 problem, I think, of a pipeline and getting enough people ready to do it in that bit. So being able to sell what an attractive career looks like, I think, is really important. And for whatever reason right now, despite engineering having one of the highest employment rates and the highest levels of remuneration, it's really hard to get students to do engineering. And partially it's just because they're so turned off math in 12th grade that it's kind of hard to rescue it from there.
We need a Netflix series celebrating maths and engineering or something like that.
Indeed.
Therese, speaking of diversity, you mentioned in your intro your passion to put the A into STEM and make it STEAM if we really want the best outcome. So talk to us a little bit about what that means for you.
Yeah, besides what I hope is reasonably obvious and is continuing to be communicated here today, without having the arts, the humanities, the social sciences and all of that roundedness, we often will focus on just one part of ST, E or M and not necessarily get a full outcome. I think it also encourages those that are in STEM to think a little bit more holistically than just what you can become quite siloed in what your technological or technical discipline is. So being able to put your head up and share around and talk across the whole of STEAM, I think, is really important. I think it also tends to be, unfortunately, more attractive to different genders and for all forms of types of diversity, not just gender, that are attracted more to some of the areas that are in the arts. So being able to embrace that workforce and have them involved in things that end up in the built environment that are serving humanity is absolutely critical. When we do that, I think it also helps us really answer and respond to the topic more holistically around resilience in a crisis. And the definition of what a crisis is incredibly different. So, you know, are we in crisis in Australia at all? I mean, Australia is probably the luckiest country on the planet, but then the planet is in crisis. So how you look at that in the areas of arts and humanities, in the base humanness of psychology and philosophy is important. I mean, it's called a PhD Doctor of Philosophy for a reason, which I think we've actually all forgotten, that it's actually meant to be that philosophical thought of what you're doing around whatever you're technically paying attention to. And for me, the A kind of wraps all that up in one. No pressure on the A.
No pressure on the A.
Oh yeah, steam pressure, yeah, that was funny.
Pardon the pun. Jane, I mean, you and I, not that we like to talk in silos, I take the point that Therese has just made around STEAM, but we do share a passion for the E in the word, and particularly for increasing diversity in that. So what do you think are the top 2 or 3 things that Australia needs to do to unlock greater diversity, gender diversity in engineering?
It's a great question. So I'll come to gender diversity in a minute. On cultural diversity and other lenses of diversity, Australia doesn't do too badly in the engineering realms. 62% of the engineering workforce in Australia are born overseas, but it's a very inefficient system. Only 50%, around half of overseas born engineers coming into Australia can find engineering work, and there's a whole range of reasons for that, and there's a report that Engineers Australia has issued on that. We've also done a lot of work in partnership with ATSE, which has been really important. So we need to support better skilled migrants when they come into Australia to find engineering work, is the upshot there. On gender diversity, we still have a long way to go. We've just finished crunching the 2021 census data, and the proportion of women in the engineering workforce in Australia has gone up from around 12% in 2016 to around 14% in 2021. But 72% of female engineers in Australia were born overseas. 3.8% of the engineering workforce are Australian-born women, 3.8%. And that's gone down since 2016. It was 3.9% in 2016, which you would expect because we're bringing in a lot more overseas-born engineers. So we are not reaching young Australian schoolgirls and women to the extent that we think we are, because the percentages overall are going up. Brian has touched on a lot of initiatives that we should be looking at. We should be focused on the school years, removing gender biases in STEM. We're moving in a good direction there, but there's more work to do. We need to focus on maths education and how we teach maths in an inspiring way and in an applied way, so kids can understand why maths is important and all the cool and fun things that you can do with it. We need to create more inclusive learning environments at universities and more inclusive work environments out in the workplace. And as Brian mentioned, there are so many things that we can do to keep women in the workforce. Supporting them during their child-rearing years, parental leave more broadly. And I think it's about making engineering careers attractive for everyone, but especially women, if we want to boost those numbers up right throughout their career. And there are some very important positive flow and consequences of that, which are around building a really experienced engineering workforce. It's not enough with complexity in our workforce these days. It's not enough just to have qualified engineers in our workforce. We need deeply experienced engineers with expertise who can usefully contribute and build on and evolve and improve the very complicated and complex systems that we're all working with.
No, thanks very much for that. Susannah, going back to communicating and engaging and getting the community on board, how do we inspire Australia to engage with evidence and value science more? You know, what would that look like for you if I said you've got all the money and resources in the world to do it?
Wow. Well, first of all, I'd really like to support Therese in the A, because I think that engaging with the entire population and not just sections of the population really does need to involve arts and humanities. If you just think about the value of humour, for example, in terms of getting information across, news is a really sort of blunt instrument when it comes to getting information across. It's good for the shock value, but it's not very good for the nuance and for getting people to discuss and debate and think. So, even things like having more science, more engineers in cultural activities, let's say television programs, Neighbours, engineering Neighbours. Can we actually work with some of the people who are producing television programs to put more, more of these issues, more of these people into these programs to get the general population thinking more about them? So that would be one thing. So humour, I think, is incredibly important. But, I think the other thing is that it would be really lovely if all of the organisations in Australia who, at the moment, we're kind of collaborating, but at the same time, we're sort of working in silos. We all are out for our own survival, which is understandable, fair enough. But there's a lot of organisations with evidence at our core. If we were to work together more to promote evidence and to amplify each other's evidence, then I think we could do a lot more in terms of engaging the population and providing the population with the good quality information that's out there, but it's kind of in different places and not being pulled together. So if I had all the money in the world, that's what I would do. There'd be an overarching organisation.
Yeah.
And just as an aside, it's really interesting in the UK, they have an organisation called Sense About Science, which has something called Evidence Week, you know, where they go into Parliament, they go out into the community, they use celebrities, and it's all about evidence. They're not talking about particular issues, they're talking about what does good evidence look like? And they run sort of hashtag, you know, ask for evidence campaigns, and they're really trying to promote the idea of what does good evidence look like. And I think we could do something like that here.
Yeah, no, that would be a really interesting idea. Daniel, I'm going to change topics a little because we've talked a lot about the strategy specifically for Australia to become more resilient. And if we think about that and what we've heard this morning around driving industries to decarbonise, what role can Australia play in helping others in the region tackle these same issues? And how important do you think it is for us to play that broader role?
I think it's a huge opportunity. We talked a bit earlier about Australia being a superpower in the renewable space, and if we touch on the Pilbara again for a second, there's an opportunity for us to move from just capturing and extracting resources such as vanadium and lithium and rare earths to becoming a leader in manufacturing of things like green steel production. And when we look at those areas and the opportunity, how do we catalyse that quickly is a question and an opportunity. And each state's enabling it differently, but I really think we need more state and federal government support to fast track some of those areas. As an example, POSCO is trying to set up green steel on scale in the Pilbara, and they're being lobbied by the US, by the Middle East, by all these other countries to set up green steel elsewhere with all sorts of incentives, fast-tracked approvals, etc. How do we as a government, how do we as an industry help make it easier for manufacturing to be set up in that renewable space so that we can capture this opportunity so we don't miss it? Is a really important question for us to think about and respond to.
Yeah, excellent. And Brian, lastly to you, you know, it's been a great conversation so far, and we've touched on a few different topics, the importance of STEM and STEAM, more importantly, in our culture, human-centred design, the role of identifying the right stakeholders, and then how do you go about engaging them in this world, and the essential need for greater diversity and thought, and our role just then on helping others. You said in your intro that your role at ANU had given you sort of a touch on everything, so I'm going to give you the everything question. How imperative is it for Australia to get this right? And do you think we're moving fast enough?
So, I mean, I am very concerned about Australia completely relying on our commodities, and we are very lucky that we are probably going to be a renewable energy superpower. Whether or not we can get some economic complexity out of that will be interesting. I mean, we don't have a lot of people, and the resources will be where there aren't a lot of people. So it's going to be highly automated, probably going to require foreign capital to come in. But I think this group has to be very focused on how do we diversify our economy, because we are so reliant on such a small number of things. You know, our use of iron ore is probably at peak. It's probably going to fade. I don't think it's going to fall off a cliff, but it's going to fade. Lithium obviously is something that's interesting. There's the rare earths and other critical minerals. So there's going to be a stream there, but we're very vulnerable to economic shocks, as we have seen over COVID. And you could imagine a geopolitical shock of some sort coming that would really, really take 25% of our GDP out. We have an incredibly strong research capability in the country. We are not good at creating the ecosystem where the research, the industry, and government programs come together. So if I look to the United States, where I grew up, when you do a large amount of defense work in the United States, it is designed to create companies and economic return. Our system here, and we're looking at spending huge amounts of money, is designed, as near as I can tell, to ship money overseas or to take talent and put it into non-productive places. That is, that's what it looks like to me. So I do think we need to sit back on a design, and this is where we do need economists to sit down and say, how do we go through and have the sovereign requirements as a country that we're going to need to be resilient and secure going forward? How do we do that at the lowest possible cost? And that's almost certainly going to be involving not the lowest possible cost in a 3-month procurement cycle, but over a 35, 40-year cycle where we build our own capacity. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. It is not easy, but I have certainly been very strong at proposing to various ministers a sort of a more of a mission style thing where we, for example, in let's say rare earths, if we've already talked, of course, about energy, but if we really do want to be part of rare earths or lithium and other minerals, coming and working with partners and creating essentially a cycle of how we can, make sure that the final product actually is secure to a geopolitical threat. How do we do that inexpensively? And what part is Australia going to be in that? And it's not going to just be digging the lithium out. We're going to have the cheap energy. We're going to be able to process it. We have lots of land. So we could take up more of the value cycle. That's one idea. But it's not going to just emerge organically from the companies of Australia right now. It's too complex. And so you need to go in and say, let's create someone who's prepared to put in $5–10 billion worth of investment and get an outcome as cheaply as possible, that's as best as possible for the Australian people. And you can imagine the same thing around $2 a kilo hydrogen and all sorts of things that we know as a nation we need to do. But I think we're going to have to be a little more interventionist, but it also has to be beyond just Australia. We're going to need lots of foreign investment, so you're going to have to be partnering with, the US, Canada, UK, Europe, Indonesia, a whole bunch of partners. But I think it's going to have a lot more design than it does right now.
Yeah, that sounds like there could be another whole panel on that.
It could be a year's worth of work. Yes.
I'm going to turn to the audience. Have we got any questions for the panel here today? We've got one over there and then down the back.
Snow Barlow. Is that on? Yes.
Yep.
Snow Barlow, Melbourne University. Susannah, I was attracted by your explanation of the next step for communication in science. In other words, engaging with the new genres of social media. If Brian asked you to revamp and enhance the communication skills of his PhD cohort, what would you do?
Yeah, well, look, I think the first thing is to actually take the communications avenues that PhD students and younger are using already and see them as an asset. So that would be the starting point. At the moment, I feel like a lot of younger scientists that I know, including my adult children, are kind of, the way that they use social media is mostly in a social context, which is fair enough. And I feel that it's often seen as a waste of time. But if we were to actually go and say, well, hang on a minute, they've got skills. They've developed these skills over years. They're actually really good at this stuff. Why don't we see that as an asset, encourage them to use it responsibly and with information in mind, actually train them in certain aspects, and use it, and actually build that into the curriculum, if you like, so that it becomes something that is a natural part of science and not seen as a sort of weird kind of add-on. There's one example. One of our trainings that we do with scientists is about do-it-yourself video. How do you create video that the media can use? And one of the things that we found is that almost every lab has a GoPro nerd, somebody who absolutely loves to use GoPros, put something on their head and go out into the field. It's like, great, use them. say, okay, terrific, the next time we go out on a field trip, put on your GoPro, we'll take some footage, we'll use it. And I think it's just a matter of attitude change, really.
Excellent. We had one down the back.
Hi, my name is Nick Francis Gilly. We talked before about climate change, and then we've just talked about great design, about listening, getting gender diversity, having women in STEM, and there's been incremental change and not at the speed that we need. Last week we voted 60% not to listen, at no cost to ourselves, right? So do we need to think, for those of us who do see the data, see the evidence, and see these huge issues not shifting, do we have to think about what change looks like and whether we are radical enough in the way that we think about change? Because it seems that we've said legislation or government stepping in, they're not going to. We can see that the influences on them are not enabling them to do that. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, do we need to think more radically or to get the change that we obviously need in both sessions so far this morning?
Yeah, it's quite interesting how much we can mobilise when we have an acute event, something like COVID, and the whole world acutely responded to that. And I was at a wonderful event recently here in Canberra where a climate scientist indicated that the quantum of money that had been spent on that, even just 12%, would have decarbonised or got us to net zero by 2030. So we can mobilise the money, the politics, the regulation in acute events. How do we do climate change, gender, voice, listening in an acute sense rather than chronic? These are chronic long-term things that people don't see. And I'm not sure how we make that happen when people don't see it directly on their doorstep and directly impacting them. As a volunteer bushfire fighter out on the fires in 2019, 2020, a lot of people started saying, oh, here's the climate change evidence, call to action, here's a crisis, and yet we still haven't, even in that acute event, managed to achieve it. So I really don't know. Part of what I try to advocate for is a lot more storytelling. And everything from, and we were talking about this last night, about attracting STEM people into the water sector. Well, should we be talking about the mechanical engineer we need and the electrical engineer and that, or do we talk about the water practitioner and the water outcomes that they do to serve humanity? But again, that's still very chronic, not acute. So very, very challenging and something for ATSE to tackle.
No, I think it's a great point. If we talk about gender diversity, I think it's really exciting to see the areas where we probably have greater gender diversity in engineering often are around the social and environmental outcomes of what we deliver. And so that storytelling and how we reframe the narrative is so important, because the social and environmental impact actually traverses all types of engineering, but there's certain pockets of it that we've articulated it well in areas of water or the environmental sciences. And I think that we need to get better at articulating how exciting it is to be in engineering and in science because of the outcomes that we deliver and the burning platform. So decarbonisation is a burning platform, and for whatever reason, we're not necessarily getting the message through that we've got to move fast and hard, and it's an exciting place to be.
Certainly. I think we've got room for one more question. Somebody's already got a mic, and then I'll let you all loose on them at morning tea.
Thank you. It's David Noon from Ground Probe and Aurecon. I have two questions, and it leverages on the two conversation point, one around gender in STEM. In Latin America, such in Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, and also I've got some experience at a university in the US where it's unheard of to not have 50-50 in engineering, in industrial engineering, in geological resource engineering. It's not even discussed, it's 50-50. So that's something cultural that they have got right. And there's a learning, I think, that perhaps we should think about here in Australia, why we are not actually encouraging young girls to be able to take STEM or STEAM to be able to build that. So that's a comment and perhaps a question of why. And the second one for Brian, when you mentioned about mathematics and, you know, from K to 12, I mean, when I was taught mathematics 30 years ago, it was very different to how my daughter, who's 12, and my son, who's 20, how they are taught mathematics at school. It's so different. Like when I was taught mathematics, it was like the fundamentals, and then you build on the fundamentals to see the beauty of mathematics, and then it's applied later on once you've got those fundamentals, where it seems now that the education system at high school and primary school is more about less on the fundamentals and learning the fundamentals, but more on how do you apply with it now. And I think it misses the beauty and the artistic of mathematics to be able to apply that into future applications. So I just thought I'd ask for comments from both Brian and Jane on culture diversity from overseas lessons and also around the dilemma of mathematics.
All right. You want to go on one of them?
I'm happy to do gender and then we'll go to
Sure,
maths.
okay.
So gender, we're very well aware that in other countries, you're quite right, South America, but also India, Pakistan, even Germany, very much close to 50-50, and it's absolutely culture. Annually, we catch up with other countries at the International Engineering Alliance annual meetings, and we talk to all these countries. And there's a story that goes in Pakistan that if you've got 3 kids, you want one of them to be a lawyer, one to be a doctor, and one to be an engineer. It just goes without saying. It has high regard, there's high esteem for engineers, they're well paid. There are tend to be huge populations in those countries and more people seeking to become engineers than there are spots at university. So it's very competitive. And so there's a bit of a reinforcing feedback loop happening there. We don't have that in Australia. We haven't seen any evidence that there are people knocking on university doors wanting to study engineering and they can't get in. And that's partly because of the cultural reasons that it's just not seen in high regard. One statistic for you in our Women in Engineering research, we surveyed hundreds of women who didn't choose engineering to understand why they didn't choose engineering. They'd chosen medicine, health, economics, architecture, science. 90% of the women we interviewed either didn't even consider engineering at all or only barely considered it. And the main reason cited was just a lack of awareness of what engineering is and what engineers do. So it goes to the narrative point. I think we need to do much better storytelling to teachers, careers advisors, parents and students and the community more broadly on how fulfilling engineering is and technology and science careers, how they help make the world a better place, the human aspects of it, how rewarding it is, and what a broad range of career opportunities. There's almost nothing that you can't do. It's a bit of a choose your own adventure. Work out how you want to make a positive difference to the world, and there's almost certainly a STEM career that sits behind that.
So on the question of pedagogy, I mean, as I said, I'm not a pedagogy expert, but I would be very careful in saying the pedagogy at the type you're talking about is the problem. The problem from the data here is people are just not taking advanced mathematics. So they're dropping out way before they get there. So I think it's how do we keep people focused on math, making sure that they don't disengage at the age of 12 or 13, and making sure they go all the way through year 17. And so, you know, I proposed at ANU that everyone needed to have both literacy and mathematics to get into ANU, and oh my God, I had it and it's gone now because the rancor was so big, you know, ministers writing me everything. It's okay to have literacy for everyone, but not numeracy right now. I think that's wrong. I'm not going to get a chance to put it in, but I would put it in because we have more students who want to come to ANU than we have spots now. And I can start making hard choices about who I want in my university. And that will be one of them.
Excellent. Well, I think we might be the only thing standing between you and your morning coffee. So in 20 seconds or less each, your call to action to the room on this topic. We'll start.
Be involved in at least 2 forums of ATSE.
Yay, that's a good one.
Have more conversations in your personal and professional networks about STEM careers, both to encourage more young Australians to choose STEM careers and also to help policy and decision makers understand the value of STEM work so that they make more informed decisions and more informed designs.
There's never been a more exciting time to be an engineer or a scientist. So let's inspire the next generation by talking about the social, environmental and economic outcomes we can deliver.
let's form an alliance for evidence and make sure that young scientists and engineers and technologists using social media are an important part of it.
I think we need to focus on gaining economic complexity into our country, and everything else will follow if there's demand for people with jobs in these things.
Thank you so much. If we can put our hands together for our panel. Thank you.
Thank you.